The photograph exists. 5 men, 5 tractors, 1 field, 4 green, 1 red. It was taken October 3rd, 2021. Outside Hays, Kansas. Harvest season. The kind of morning where the wheat stands gold and the air smells like dust and diesel and money. The man in front of the Massey Ferguson didn't smile. His arms were crossed. His boots were caked in mud from a field that hadn't dried since September rain. Behind him, the 8740S sat idle, engine warm, ready for work. Behind him, 4 John Deere tractors lined up like soldiers. 9R series, 8R series. The kind of equipment that costs more than most houses. The kind of equipment that says something about a man before he opens his mouth. The photograph was supposed to be a joke, a memorial to bad decision-making. A before picture for a story about how not to run a farm. 3 of those men took copies, sent them to their sons, posted them in private farmer groups where men who've never lost a crop discuss men who have. They called it the last stand. They meant it as an insult. 18 months later, that same photograph hangs in a different place, different frame, different meaning. This is the story of what happened between those 2 moments. This is the story of a man who bet his farm on a brand everyone told him was wrong. This is the story of what happens when horsepower meets pride. And when the field doesn't care about your reputation. His name is Frank Miller, 62 years old, 340 hectares of wheat and sorghum in Ellis County, 38 years of farming, 2 sons who don't farm anymore, 1 wife who stopped asking questions in 1997, and 1 Massey Ferguson that either saved everything or cost him everything, depending on who you ask. Frank Miller didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray 30 years of brand loyalty. It happened slower than that, more painfully. The kind of decision that gets made in pieces over months in the space between what a man can afford and what he's been told he should want. For 30 years, Frank bought John Deere, not because he loved the color green, not because he believed the marketing, but because that's what his father bought, and his father's father before that, and because the dealer in Hays knew his name, and because when something broke, parts arrived same day. And because in rural Kansas, certain choices aren't really choices at all. They're inheritance. But inheritance doesn't pay for itself. And by 2020, Frank was carrying debt the way some men carry regret. Quietly, constantly, in the background of every decision. The numbers started in a spreadsheet. Frank's wife Martha kept the books. She'd been doing it since their oldest son was in diapers. She knew what every piece of equipment cost. She knew what every repair bill meant. She knew when the interest payments started eating more than the harvest produced. In March 2020, she put a folder on the kitchen table. Inside, maintenance records for the 2015 John Deere 8270R, fuel consumption logs, downtime calculations, resale value projections. At the bottom, a single sheet with 3 numbers. What the Deere was worth, $187,000. What it would cost to keep running for 5 more years, $94,000. What a comparable Massey Ferguson would cost new, with warranty, $215,000. The math wasn't complicated. The Deere had 8,400 hours. The engine had been rebuilt once. The transmission was making a sound that the dealer called normal wear and Frank called expensive. But the math wasn't the point. The point was what came after the math. Frank drove to Hays, walked into the John Deere dealership, asked about trade-in value on the 8270R. The salesman, a man Frank had known for 15 years, whose kids went to school with his kids, gave him a number, $142,000, $45,000 below market, below what the folder said, below what Frank needed to make the numbers work. When Frank asked why, the salesman didn't look at him. "Market's soft, Frank. You know how it is." Frank knew how it was. The market wasn't soft. The market was exactly what it had been for 6 months. But Frank was also something else. He was a man who'd been buying from this dealership since 1985. He was a man who'd never traded with anyone else. He was a man who'd recommended this dealership to 7 other farmers in the county. He was a man who was being told his loyalty had no value. Frank left without signing anything, drove home, didn't speak to Martha for 3 hours. That night he searched Massey Ferguson dealers within 200 miles, found one in Salina, called the next morning. The salesman in Salina didn't know Frank's name, didn't know his father's name, Didn't know what brand he'd been buying for 30 years. All he knew was the numbers, and the numbers said yes. The photograph wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be a routine equipment comparison, the kind that happens every year in farming country. 5 neighbors, 5 fields that touch, same soil, same weather, same market prices. The only difference was the equipment. The tradition started in 2018. Dale Peterson, the man with the newest Deere, a 9R 540 that cost more than Frank's entire operation, suggested they document harvest efficiency. Compare fuel usage, compare acres per hour, compare downtime. It was framed as data collection. It was actually competition. Frank agreed, not because he wanted to compete, but because refusing would have looked like weakness. In farming, you show up, you put your equipment in the line, you let the field judge you. What Frank didn't know was that 2021 would be the year he showed up different. October 2nd, the day before the photograph. Frank's Massey Ferguson 8740S arrived on a flatbed from Salina, red paint gleaming, hour meter at 0, warranty paperwork in the glove compartment. Martha stood in the driveway and watched it get unloaded. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Frank knew what she was thinking. 30 years, one decision. Everything changed. The other 4 farmers found out the next morning. Dale Peterson called before sunrise. "Heard you went red, Frank." "Heard right." "Massey?" "Massey." Silence. The kind of silence that carries weight. "Photo day's tomorrow. You still in?" Frank could have said no, could have claimed mechanical issues, could have sat this one out, could have waited until next year when the new equipment had some hours on it and some stories behind it. He didn't. Be there. October 3rd, 6:47 a.m. The field was already warm. The wheat was ready. The combines were lined up at the north edge, waiting for the tractors to move grain carts into position. Dale arrived first, then Rick, then Tom, then Mike. 4 green tractors, 4 men who'd been buying Deere longer than Frank had been farming. They didn't say anything when Frank pulled up in the Massey. Didn't have to. The look on their faces said everything. Dale walked over, stood next to the 8740S, ran his hand along the fender like he was inspecting livestock at auction. "Nice paint, thanks. Shame it'll get dirty. That's the plan." Dale stepped back, pulled out his phone, called the other 3 over. "Get in here. We need to document this." Frank knew what was happening, knew what the photograph meant, knew that within an hour, this image would be in group chats and private forums and dinner table conversations across 3 counties. He also knew he couldn't stop it, so he stood in front of the Massey Ferguson. Arms crossed, face set, eyes on the camera. Let them take the picture. Let them tell the story. The field would tell a different one. Frank didn't buy the Massey Ferguson to prove anything to anyone. That's what he told Martha. That's what he told himself. That's what he said when his brother called from Oklahoma to ask if he'd lost his mind. But ego doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up in spreadsheets or equipment manifests. It shows up in the space between what a man says and what he does. Frank said it was about numbers, and it was. The Massey Ferguson 8740S delivered 396 horsepower at a price point that made the comparable Deere look like financial advice from a stranger. The fuel efficiency was better. The warranty was longer. The dealer in Salina was hungry for business and willing to work on terms. But Frank also said yes to the photograph. Could have declined. Could have waited. Could have let the equipment prove itself before putting it on display next to 4 tractors that cost more than his house. He didn't. There's a reason for that. 30 years of being the man who bought what he was told to buy. 30 years of nodding when the dealer explained why prices went up. 30 years of watching other farmers get better terms because they shopped around. 30 years of loyalty that wasn't rewarded. The Massey Ferguson wasn't just equipment, it was a statement. And statements need audiences. Dale Peterson understood this better than anyone. He'd been farming longer than Frank, had inherited more land, had equipment that looked like it belonged in a showroom instead of a field. He also had a reputation for knowing which farmers were serious and which ones were playing. The photograph was his way of drawing a line. On one side, men who understood what equipment meant, men who invested in brands that held value, men who didn't gamble with generational operations. On the other side, Frank, the message was clear. You can buy whatever you want, but don't expect us to pretend it's the same. Frank received that message, understood it, accepted it. What Dale didn't understand was that Frank had already accepted something else. The possibility of being wrong, the possibility of regret, the possibility that 30 years of instinct might have been 30 years of compliance. Sometimes a man needs to bet everything to find out if he's been brave or just careful. Frank placed his bet. The field would collect. The first 3 months were quiet. Harvest ended. The wheat was sold. The numbers came in better than expected, not because of the Massey Ferguson, not because of anything Frank did differently, but because the market moved in his favor and the weather cooperated, and sometimes farming is just luck wearing work boots. The photograph circulated. Frank heard about it secondhand. A guy at the co-op mentioned seeing it. A neighbor's son said it was in a Facebook group. Dale Peterson never brought it up directly. That's how these things work in rural Kansas. Nothing is said, everything is known. Frank used the Massey Ferguson through winter. Plowing, planting, spraying. The machine performed. No major breakdowns, no unexpected repairs. The fuel consumption matched the specifications. The dealer in Salina answered calls on the first ring. By March, Frank started to believe he'd made the right decision. By April, he started to believe he'd made a smart decision. By May, he stopped thinking about the photograph entirely. Then the rain came. Not normal rain, not the kind that helps crops, the kind that turns fields into lakes and harvest windows into memories. 3 weeks of precipitation that should have fallen over 3 months. The soil saturated, the low spots flooded, the high spots turned to mud, and the harvest deadline moved closer. This is where equipment stops being about specifications and starts being about survival. This is where horsepower meets torque meets terrain meets time. This is where the field stops caring about your brand preference and starts asking one question: can you get the job done? Frank's Massey Ferguson could. The 4 John Deeres could not. Not because Deere makes inferior equipment. They don't. But because Dale's 9R540 was designed for open field efficiency, not mud. Because Rick's 8R had a tire configuration that worked better on dry ground. Because Tom and Mike had older models that hadn't been updated for wet conditions. And because Frank's Massey Ferguson had a weight distribution and traction system that handled saturated soil better than any of them expected. The first day of harvest after the rain, all 5 tractors went into the same field. North section, 40 hectares. The ground was still soft. The wheat was standing but vulnerable. One wrong move and the combine would sink. One delay and the moisture content would ruin the grain. Dale went first. His Deere made it 30 meters before the wheels started spinning. He tried to power through. The spinning got worse. He stopped before he dug himself in. Rick went next. Same result. Tom and Mike didn't bother trying. Frank waited, watched, calculated. Then he put the Massey Ferguson in gear. The tractor moved, slow, deliberate. The tires gripped, the weight distributed. The engine didn't strain. It worked. Not dramatically, not heroically, just competently. By noon, Frank had cleared the north section. By sunset, he'd helped pull 2 of the Deeres out of mud they shouldn't have entered. That night, Dale Peterson called. Your tractor handled better. It did. How? Ask your dealer. Dale didn't respond. Didn't need to. The question wasn't about the tractor anymore. It was about what the tractor represented. Frank had bet on something different, and different had worked. But the story wasn't over. Success makes enemies faster than failure does. Frank learned this in June, 2 months after the mud incident, 3 months after the photograph, 6 months after he signed the Massey Ferguson paperwork. The call came from Martha. She was at the co-op buying seed for the fall planting. Overheard a conversation. 3 men, 1 name. Frank's name. He got lucky. 1 field doesn't prove anything. Wait until something breaks, then we'll see where he gets parts. Frank heard the summary when he got home. Didn't react, didn't argue, didn't call anyone to defend himself. Because they weren't entirely wrong. Luck had played a role. The mud conditions had favored his equipment configuration. 1 successful harvest didn't validate a 30-year brand switch. And if something major broke, the Salina dealer was an hour away, while the Hayes Deere dealer was 10 minutes from his driveway. These were real concerns, not gossip, not jealousy. Actual operational risks that needed to be managed. Frank managed them the only way a farmer can. He kept working, kept the Massey Ferguson in the field, kept the maintenance schedule religious, changed oil on time, replaced filters before they needed replacing, documented everything. If this machine was going to prove itself, it would prove itself through reliability, not through one good day in the mud. July brought heat, the kind that cracks soil and tests cooling systems. The Massey Ferguson ran at operating temperature without issues. The engine didn't strain, the hydraulics held pressure, the electronics didn't glitch. August brought wind, the kind that flattens wheat and creates harvest urgency. The Massey Ferguson logged 12-hour days without complaints. September brought the first real test. A hydraulic line burst during planting prep. Not a catastrophic failure, not a design flaw. Just a worn line that reached the end of its service life. Frank called Selena. The dealer had the part in stock, promised overnight shipping. The part arrived the next morning. Frank installed it himself. Lost half a day, moved on. This is what reliability looks like. Not the absence of problems, the presence of solutions. But the conversation at the co-op didn't stop. If anything, it intensified. Because Frank's success made other men reconsider their own decisions. And reconsideration feels like regret. And regret needs somewhere to go. Dale Peterson started making calls, not to Frank, to the John Deere regional representative, to other dealers, to men who could influence Frank's operation. The message was subtle, consistent, repeated. Massey Ferguson doesn't have the support network. Massey Ferguson parts take longer. Massey Ferguson resale value is lower. Massey Ferguson is a risk that gets bigger every year. Frank heard about these calls, not directly, through the same channels that carried the co-op conversations, through the network that exists in every rural community where information moves faster than equipment. He could have responded, could have defended his decision publicly, could have challenged Dale to another equipment comparison, could have turned this into the kind of rivalry that gets talked about for decades. He didn't. Because Frank understood something Dale didn't. This was never about the tractors. This was about what happens when a man stops doing what he's supposed to do and starts doing what he thinks he should do, and what happens when other men have to watch him live with the consequences. October 2022. 1 year after the photograph. 1 year after Frank brought the Massey Ferguson home. The harvest window opened narrower than anyone expected. Weather forecasts showed 7 days of dry conditions, then 2 weeks of rain, then uncertainty. 7 days to clear 800 hectares across 5 farms. The traditional approach would have been coordination, equipment sharing, labor pooling, the kind of cooperation that exists in farming communities because survival depends on it. Dale Peterson proposed a different approach. The 4 Deere owners would work together, share combines, share grain carts, share labor. Frank could join if he wanted, but there would be conditions. The Massey Ferguson would run last, behind the Deeres, on the fields they'd already cleared. If there was time remaining, Frank could harvest his own land. If there wasn't, he could wait until after the rain. This wasn't cooperation. This was hierarchy. Frank received the proposal on a Tuesday, had 48 hours to respond. Martha sat at the kitchen table while he read the text message. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Frank typed his response. 3 words. I'll manage. Sent it, put the phone down, went outside, started the Massey Ferguson. What followed was 72 hours that would define the next decade of Frank's operation. He worked 18-hour days, slept in the cab when exhaustion hit, ate when the engine was refueled. The Massey Ferguson ran continuously. No major issues. 1 minor sensor alert that Frank cleared himself. By day 3, he'd cleared 200 hectares, half his land. The Deere group had cleared theirs. But they'd also cleared 3 of Frank's fields they had access to through shared boundary agreements. Fields Frank needed harvested before the rain. Day 4. Frank received a call from Rick, one of the 4, the quietest of the group, the one who'd never said much during the equipment comparisons. Dale's not happy. About what? You're making us look bad. Frank didn't respond, didn't need to. Rick continued. 4 Deeres, 1 Massey. We should be done first. We're not. People are noticing. Tell Dale to buy better equipment. Rick laughed, actually laughed, then hung up. Day 5. The rain forecast moved up, 6 days instead of 7, then 5, then 4. Frank accelerated, the Massey Ferguson held, the engine temperature stayed stable, the fuel consumption stayed efficient, the operator stayed functional. Day 6. Frank finished his last hectare at 3:47 a.m. The rain started at 6 a.m. He drove home, showered, slept for 4 hours. Woke up to a text from Dale. Nice work. That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement of what had happened. No admission that the hierarchy had been inverted. Just 2 words. Frank saved the message. Didn't respond. The harvest was complete. The grain was sold. The numbers were calculated. And the photograph took on new meaning. The photograph still exists. Same 5 men. Same 5 tractors. Same field. But it hangs in different places now. Frank has a copy in his office, not framed prominently, not displayed for visitors. Just there. A reminder of what happened between the moment it was taken and the moment it meant something different. Dale Peterson doesn't have his copy anymore. Removed it from the wall sometime in winter. Didn't tell anyone why. Didn't need to. The other 3 farmers still have theirs, but they don't show it to people anymore. Not because they're ashamed, because the story that photograph tells changed, and stories matter more than images. Frank's Massey Ferguson has 2,400 hours on it now. 2 years of operation, 0 major repairs, 1 hydraulic line, 2 filters, regular maintenance, the kind of reliability record that gets talked about at the co-op. The conversations changed, slowly, quietly. The way these things change in rural communities where reputation is currency and proof is the only thing that spends. Men who used to ask, "Why'd you switch?" now ask, "How's it running?" Men who used to offer unsolicited advice about parts availability now ask about fuel consumption. Men who used to include Frank in cautionary tales now include him in success stories. This is what victory looks like in farming. Not parades, not announcements, not public tenrin, just a gradual shift in how your name is spoken when you're not in the room. Frank didn't trade his 11 John Deeres all at once. That's not how these transitions work. He replaced equipment as it reached end of life, made decisions based on numbers, bought Massey Ferguson when the math supported it, bought John Deere when the math supported that instead. The story isn't about brand betrayal, it's about brand evaluation. And the photograph isn't about rivalry. It's about what happens when a man makes a decision and lives with it long enough for the consequences to reveal themselves. Dale Peterson still farms, still buys John Deere, still has better equipment than most men in the county. The relationship with Frank is professional, cordial, distant. They work together when coordination makes sense. They work separately when it doesn't. They don't talk about the photograph. They don't talk about the harvest. They don't talk about what happened. Some things don't need discussion. Frank's sons still don't farm. That hasn't changed. The operation will eventually be sold or leased. The land will continue. The equipment will move to someone else. But for now, the Massey Ferguson runs, and Frank drives it, and the field accepts both. That's enough. Farming doesn't reward loyalty. It rewards results. Frank Miller learned this over 38 years. Learned it slowly. Learned it through debt and maintenance bills and dealer conversations that felt more like lectures than partnerships. The Massey Ferguson didn't save his farm. The numbers saved his farm. The Massey Ferguson was just the tool that matched the numbers. But tools matter, and brand matters, and the decision to switch matters more than the equipment itself. Because every time Frank starts that tractor, he's making the same decision he made 2 years ago. He's choosing to trust his own evaluation over inherited wisdom. He's choosing to accept risk over comfort. He's choosing to let performance define value instead of reputation. Not every farmer can do this. Not every farmer should do this. Some operations depend on dealer relationships that took generations to build. Some operations depend on resale value that only certain brands provide. Some operations depend on support networks that exist only around certain equipment. Frank's operation depended on something else. It depended on a man who was willing to find out if 30 years of instinct was 30 years of wisdom or 30 years of habit. The answer was somewhere in between, and the photograph captures that moment, the moment before the answer was known. The moment when everything was still possible. The moment when 5 tractors lined up and only one of them was about to prove something. Not about brand, about the man who chose it. The rain came, the harvest finished, The grain sold, the photograph exists, Frank Miller still farms, the Massey Ferguson still runs. And in Ellis County, Kansas, when men discuss equipment decisions, they don't use Frank's story as a warning anymore. They use it as a question. What are you willing to bet? That's the only question that matters. Everything else is just horsepower.